Continuing where I left off, Chapter 14. On the 31st of December, the eve of the new year, 1810, an old grandee of the Captain Day was giving a ball and a midnight supper. The diplomatic corps and the Tsar were to be present. The grandee's well-known mansion on the English Embankment blazed with countless lights. Police were stationed at the brightly lit, red-carpeted entrance. And not only gendarmes, but even the chief of police and dozens of officers stood at the carriage porch. As the carriages drove away, fresh ones kept arriving with red-livered footmen, and footmen in plum hats. From the carriages emerged men wearing uniforms, stars, and ribbons, and ladies in satin and ermine who cautiously descended the carriage steps that were let down for them with a clatter, then swiftly and noiselessly passed along the red baize at the entrance. Almost every time a carriage drove up, a whisper ran through the crowd and caps were doffed. The emperor? No. A minister? Prince? Ambassador? Don't you see the plumes? Was heard in the crowd. One of the members of the crowd, better dressed than the others, seemed to know who everyone was, and mentioned by name all the most illustrious personages of the day. A third of the guests had already arrived, but the Rostovs, who were also to be present, were still in a flurry of dressing. There had been many discussions and preparations for this ball in the Rostov family, many fears that the invitation might not come, that the dresses would not be ready, or that all would not turn out as it should be. The Rostovs were to be accompanied by Marya Inajevna Pernaskaya, a thin, sallow lady-in-waiting at the old court, who was a friend and relative of the Countess, and acting as a guide to her country cousins in Petersburg high society. They were to call for her at a house in the Tverevsky Gardens at 10 o'clock, but it was already 5 minutes to 10, and the girls were not dressed. Natasha was going to her first grand ball. She had got up at 8 o'clock that morning and had been in a fever of excitement and activity the whole day. From the moment she woke up, all her energies had been directed to ensuring that they all, herself, Mamma, and Sonia, shall be as well dressed as possible. Sonia and the Countess put themselves entirely in her hands. The Countess was to wear a claret-colored velvet gown, and the two girls white tulle over pink silk slips, with roses on their bodices. Their hair was to be arranged à la grecque. The essentials had already been done: feet, hands, neck, and ears carefully washed, perfumed, and powdered, as befits a ball. The open-work silk stockings and white satin slippers with bows were already on. Their coiffures were almost finished. Sonia was dressed, and so was the Countess. But Natasha, who had been bustling about helping everyone, was behindhand. She was still sitting before the mirror with a pigeonnier thrown over her slender shoulders. Sonia, all dressed, stood in the middle of the room, pressing the head of a pin till it hurt her little finger, as she fastened on a last ribbon that squeaked as the pin went through it. Not like that, Sonia, cried Natasha, turning her head, and with both hands clutching at her hair, which the maid who was dressing it had not time to let go. That bow is not right. Come here. Sonia sat down, and Natasha pinned the bow differently. Please, miss, I can't do it like this, said the maid who was holding Natasha's hair. Good heavens, wait then. That's right, Sonia. Will you be ready soon? Came the Countess' voice. It's nearly 10. Coming, coming. Are you ready, Mamma? I have only one to pin on my headdress. Don't do it without me, cried Natasha. You won't do it right. But it's already 10. They had decided to be at the ball by 10:30. But Natasha still had to dress, and they had to call at the Chapisky Gardens. When her hair was done, Natasha, in a short petticoat from under which her dancing slippers showed, and in her mother's peignoir, ran to Sonia, scrutinized her, and then ran to her mother. Turning the Countess's head this way and that, she pinned on her headdress, and, hurriedly kissing the grey head, ran back to the maids who were hemming her skirt. A delay was caused by Natasha's skirt being too long. Two maids were turning up the hem, hastily biting off the ends of their thread. A third, with pins in her mouth, was running from the Countess to Sonia, and a fourth held the tulle dress high in one hand. "Marusha, be quick, darling. Hand me my thimble, miss, it's there." "Will you be ready soon?" asked the Count, coming to the door. "Here's some scent for you. Perovskaya must be tired of waiting." "Ready, miss," said the maid, holding the shortened tulle dress with two fingers, and blowing and shaking something off it, as if to show by the gesture her awareness of the purity and the ethereality of what she was holding. Natasha began putting on the dress. "In a minute, in a minute. Don't come in, papa," she called to her father, who was opening the door, with her head hidden under a cloud of tulle. Sonia slammed the door shut. A minute later they let the Count in. He was wearing a blue dress coat, knee breeches, and low shoes, and was perfumed and pomaded. "Papa, how nice you look! Lovely!" said Natasha, standing in the middle of the room and smoothing in the folds of her tall skirt. "If you please, miss, allow me," said a maid, who was on her knees pulling the skirt straight, and shifting the pins from one side of her mouth to the other with her tongue. "Say what you like," cried Sonia in a despairing tone as she surveyed Natasha's dress. "Say what you like, but it's still too long." Natasha stepped back to look at herself in the pier glass. The dress was too long. "Really, madame, it's not a bit too long," said Marusha, crawling on her knees after her young lady. "Well, if it's too long, we'll take it up. We can do it in a minute," said the resolute Shasha. Taking a needle from the kerchief she wore across over her bosom, and going down on her knees and setting to work. At that moment the Countess in her velvet gown and headdress modestly and quietly came into the room. "Oh, my beauty!" exclaimed the Count. "She looks better than any of you." How would have embraced her, but she drew back, afraid of being rumpled. "Mamma, your headdress more to one side," said Natasha. "I'll repin it," and she darted forward so that the maids who were taking up her skirt could not move fast enough, and a piece of the tulle was torn off. "Mercy! What was that? Really, it wasn't my fault." "Never mind, I'll put a stitch in it. It won't show," said Sasha. "My beauty, my little queen," said the old nurse, coming to the door, "and Sanyashka too. All the beauties." At 10:15 they were at last settled in the carriages and on their way, but they still had to stop at the Chapisky Gardens. Perovskaya was ready and waiting for them. In spite of her age and homeliness, she had gone through the same process as the Rostovs, but with less flurry. For her it was a matter of routine. Her unprepossessing old body had been washed, perfumed, and powdered in exactly the same way. She had washed behind her ears just as carefully, and when she entered her drawing room in the yellow gown, wearing a decoration with the monogram of Her Imperial Majesty, her elderly maid had been as rapturously enthusiastic as the Rostov servants had been. She praised the Rostovs' attire, they praised hers, and at 11 o'clock, careful of their coffers and grounds, they settled themselves in the carriages and drove off. Chapter 15. Natasha had not a moment to herself since early morning, and had not once had time to think of what lay before her. In the damp, chill air and the confined semi-darkness of the swaying carriage, for the first time, she vividly pictured what was in store for her. There, at the ball, in those brightly lighted halls, the music, the flowers, the dancing, the Tsar, all the dazzling young people of Petersburg. The prospect was so splendid and so incongruous. with the chill darkness of the cramped carriage, that she could hardly believe it would come true. She only realized what was before her when, after walking over the red baize at the entrance, she had entered the hall, taken off her fur cloak, and with Sonia at her side, preceded her mother up the lighted staircase between the flowers. Only then did she remember how she should behave at a ball, and try to assume the stately air she considered indispensable for a girl of such occasion, but fortunately for her, she she was so dazzled that she saw nothing clearly. Her pulse beat 100 to the minute, and the blood throbbed at her heart. It was impossible for her to affect the pose that would have made her ridiculous, and she went on, almost swooning with excitement, and trying with all her might to conceal it. And this was the very attitude that became her best. Before and behind them other guests were entering, also in ball gowns, and talking in low tones. The mirrors along the staircase reflected ladies in white, pale blue, and pink gowns, with diamonds and pearls on their bare arms and necks. Natasha looked in the mirrors and could not distinguish herself from the others. All blended into the shimmery procession. On entering the ballroom, the steady hum of voices, footsteps, and greeting deafened Natasha. The light and glitter blinded her. The host and hostess, who had already been standing at the door for an hour and a half an hour repeating the same words to each arriving guest, Shama de Vosvor greeted Rostov and Perenska in the same manner. The two girls, in their white dresses, each with a rose in her black hair, made their identical courtesies, but the hostess's eye involuntarily rested longer on the slender figure of Natasha. The smile she gave her was something more than her usual smile as hostess. Looking at her, she was perhaps reminded of the golden, irretrievable days of girlhood and her own first ball. The host too followed Natasha with his eyes, and he asked the count which was his daughter. Charmante, he said, kissing the tips of her finger. In the ballroom, the guests stood crowded around the entry, waiting for the Tsar. The countess took up a position in the front rows of this group. Natasha heard and felt that several people were asking about her and looking at her. She realized that she was making a good impression on those who had noticed her, and this observation somewhat calmed her. There are some here like ourselves, and some who look worse, she thought. Perovskaya was pointing out to the countess the most notable persons at the ball. "That's the Dutch ambassador, do you see? That gray-haired man," she said, indicating an elderly man with a luxurious mass of silver-gray curls, surrounded by a group of ladies laughing at something he was telling them. "Ah, here comes the Queen of Petersburg, Countess Bezúkhov," she said, pointing to Ellen, who had just come in. "How lovely she is! She can hold her own beside Marya Antonovna. See how the men, young and old, pay court to her. She's both beautiful and clever. They say Prince is mad about her. And you see those two, though they are not in the least attractive, they are even more sought after." She was referring to a lady who was crossing the room accompanied by a very plain daughter. "That girl is heiress to millions," said Perovskaya, "and here come the suitors. That is Count Bezúkhov's brother, Anatole Kurágin," she said, indicating a handsome officer of the Horse Guards who passed by them holding himself very erect and looking at something over the heads of the ladies. "Handsome, isn't he? I'm told he's going to marry the heiress, and your cousin Drabowskoy is also very attentive to her. Millions, they say." "Oh yes, that's the French ambassador," she replied to the countess inquiring about Caulaincourt. "Look at him. He might be king, all the same. They are charming, the French, very charming. No one more charming in society. Ah, here she is. Yes, after all, there's no one to compare with our Marya Antonovna. And how simply she's dressed. Lovely. And that stout fellow with spectacles is the great Freemason," she went on, speaking of Pierre Bezúkhov. "Set him beside his wife, and he looks a regular buffoon." Pierre made his way through the throng, his stout body swaying, nodding to right and left as casually and good-naturedly as if he were strolling through a marketplace. He pushed through the crowd, evidently looking for someone. Natasha was delighted to see the familiar face of the buffoon, as Perovskaya called them, and he knew that it was they, and herself in particular, that he was seeking. Pierre had promised to be at the ball and to find partners for her. But before he reached them, Pierre stopped beside a very handsome dark man of medium height in a white uniform who was standing by a window talking to a tall man wearing stars and a ribbon. Natasha at once recognized the shorter younger man in the white uniform. It was Bakalski, who seemed to her to have grown much younger, happier, and better looking. "There's someone else we know, Balkowski. Do you see him, Mamma?" said Natasha, pointing to Prince Andrei. "You remember, he stayed a night with us at Otrino." "Oh, do you know him?" asked Perovskaya. "I can't bear him. He's all the rage now. And such conceit, it's beyond words. Takes after his father. And he's hand in glove with Speransky. They're working on some project or other. Just look how he treats the ladies. There's one talking to him, and he has turned his back on her," she said, pointing to him. "I'd soon send him packing if he treated me as he does those ladies." Chapter 16. There was a sudden stir. A murmur ran through the crowd. As they surged forward they fell back, leaving a passage down in the middle of which walked the Tsar to the strains of the orchestra that struck up as he entered. Behind him came the host and hostesses. He walked in rapidly, bowing to the right and left, and if anxious to get through the first formalities as quickly as possible. The orchestra played as polonaise in vogue at the time on account of the words that had been set to it, beginning, "Alexandra Elevsky, you are our heart's delight." The Tsar passed on to the drawing room, and the crowds made a rush for the doors, several persons dashing forward and then back again, their faces transformed. The wave receded from the doors of the drawing room, at which the Tsar reappeared in conversation with the hostess. A young man, looking distraught, bore down the ladies and begged them to move aside. Several of the ladies, with expressions that betrayed a total obliviousness to the rules of decorum, pressed forward to the detriment of their attire. The men began to choose partners and take their places for the polonaise. Everyone moved back, and the Tsar came out of the drawing room, smiling, leading the hostess by the hand, but not keeping time to the music. He was followed by the host with Maria Atanatova Narashinika, the Tsar's favorite. Then came the ambassadors, ministers, and various generals, all of whom Perneska named in turn. More than half the ladies had partners and had taken their places, or were prepared to do so for the polonaise. Natasha felt that she would be left with her mother and Sonia among the minority who were crowded near the wall, not having been invited to dance. She stood with her slender arms hanging at her sides, her scarcely defined bosom rising and falling regularly, and with bated breath and glittering, frightened eyes stared straight before her, looking as if she were prepared for the greatest joy or the greatest misery. She took no interest in the Tsar nor in all those great personages Perovskaya was pointing out. She had but one thought. Is it possible that no one will ask me, that I should not be among the first to dance? Is it really possible that none one of all those men will notice me? Those men who either don't see me, or if they do, look as if they were saying, "Oh, she's not the one, so it's no use looking at her. No, it can't be," she thought. "They must know how I long to dance, how splendidly I dance, and how much they will enjoy dancing with me." The strains of the polonaise, which had now lasted some little time, began to have a melancholy sound, like a sad memory in Natásha's ears. She felt like crying. Perovskaya had left them. The count was at the other end of the ballroom, and she and the countess and Sonia were as much alone amid the crowd of strangers as if they had been standing in the depths of a forest, of no interest, and no use to anyone. Prince Andrei passed by with a lady, obviously not recognizing them. The handsome Anatole smilingly said something to his partner and glanced in Natásha's face as one looks at a wall. Boris passed them twice, each time turning his head away. Berg and his wife, who were not dancing, came up to them. This family intimacy, here in the ballroom, was mortifying to Natásha, as though there were nowhere else for the families to talk but at a ball. She did not listen or look at Vera, who was telling her something about her own green dress. Finally the Tsar stopped beside his last partner. He had danced with three, and the music ceased. An officious aside decamp ran up to Rostóv and asked him to stand farther back, though they were already close to the wall, and from the gallery came the precise, stately, alluring cadence of the waltz. The Tsar glanced down the ballroom with a smile. A minute passed. No one had begun to dance. An aide-de-camp, the master of ceremonies, went up to the Countess Besakov and asked her to dance. Smiling, she raised her hand and laid it on the shoulder without looking at him. The aide-de-camp, a master of his art, grasped his partner firmly around the waist, and with confident deliberation commenced smoothly gliding first around the edge of the circle, then at the corner of the room caught her left hand and turned her, the only sound to be heard, apart from the quickening strains of the music, being the rhythmic click of the spurs on his swift, agile feet, while at every third beat his partner's velvet skirt seemed to flash as she whirled around. Natasha looked at them and was ready to weep because it was not she dancing the first turn of the waltz. Prince Andrei, in the white uniform of a cavalry colonel, wearing knee breeches and low-shoed shoes, stood not far from the Rostovs, looking animated and gay. Baron Verhoff was talking to him about the first sitting of the Council of State to be held the next day. As one close to Speransky and participating in the work of a legislative commission, Prince Andrei was in a position to give reliable information about this meeting, concerning which the most diverse rumors were current. But he was not listening to what Verhoff was saying, and looked now at the Tsar, now at the men who intended to dance but had not yet resolved to step out on the floor. As Prince Andrei was observing these gentlemen abashed by the sovereign's presence, and the ladies who were dying to be asked, Pierre came up to him and took him by the arm. "You always dance. I have a protégée here, the young Rostova," he said. "Where is she?" asked Volkowski. "Excuse me," he added to the Baron. "We'll finish this conversation elsewhere. At at a ball one must dance." He stepped forward in the direction indicated by Pierre, and Natásha Fomlin's dejected face caught his eye. He recognized her, saw that it was her debut, guessed her feelings, and remembering the conversation he had overheard at the window, went up to the Countess Rostov with a delighted expression on his face. "Allow me to introduce to you my daughter," said the Countess, coloring. "I have the pleasure of being acquainted with her, if the Countess remembers me," said Prince Andrei with a low and courteous bow, quite belaying Perovsky's remarks about his rudeness. Turning to Natásha, he started to put his arm around her waist before he had completed his invitation to her to dance. He suggested that they take a turn at the waltz. Natásha faced with his tremulous expression, looking as if she were on the brink of rapture of the spirit, instantly lighted up with a joyous, grateful, childlike smile. "I have been waiting for so long for you," the frightened, happy little girl seemed to be saying as she raised her hand to Prince Andrei's shoulder with a smile that shone through imminent tears. They were the second couple to enter the circle. Prince Andrei was of the best dancers of his day, and Natásha danced exquisitely. Her little feet in the satin dancing slippers moved swiftly, lightly as they had wings, and her face beamed with ecstatic happiness. Her bare arms and neck were not beautiful. Compared to Ellen's, her shoulders looked thin and bosomed undeveloped, but Ellen's seemed coated with a lacquer left by the thousands of eyes that had glanced over her body, while Natásha was a young girl appearing delicate for the first time, and who would have felt very much ashamed had she not been assured that this was quite proper. Prince Andrei danced because he enjoyed dancing, and because he was anxious to escape as quickly as possible from the political and intellectual talk that everyone addressed to him. He also wished to break through the irksome barrier of constraint arising from the Tsar's presence. He had chosen Natásha for his partner because Pierre had pointed her out to him, and because she was the first pretty girl who caught his eye, but he had no sooner put his arm around that slender, supple, quivering waist, and felt her stirring so close to him, and smiling up his face, than her charm went to his head like wine. He felt animated and rejuvenated when, drawing a deep breath, he left her and stood watching the other dancers. Chapter 17. After Prince Andrei, Boris came up to ask Natásha to dance, and he was followed by the aide-de-camp who had opened the ball and several other young men, so that Natásha, flushed and happy, and passing on her superfluous partners to Sónya, did not cease dancing the rest of the evening. She noticed nothing, saw nothing of what was interested everyone else. Not only did she fail to remark the Tsar talk a long time with the French ambassador, that his manner was particularly gracious when talking to a certain lady, or that so-and-so and Prince so-and-so did or said this or that, and that Ellen had a great success and was honored by the special attention of such and such, but she did not even see the Tsar, and was aware that he was gone only because the ball became livelier than his departure. In one of the gayest cotillons before supper, Prince Andrei again danced with Natasha. He reminded her of their first meeting in the avenue at Outreau, and how, when she had been unable to sleep that moonlight night, he had unwillingly overheard her talking. Natasha blushed at that recollection and tried to excuse herself, as if there had been something to be ashamed of in what Prince Andrei had overheard. Like all men who have grown up in society, Prince Andrei enjoyed meeting someone not of the conventional society stamp, and such was Natasha, with her wonder, her delight, and even her mistakes in speaking French. His manner was particularly careful and tender with her, as he sat beside her, talking of the simplest and most inconquestionable subjects. He admired the joyous radiance of her eyes and smile, which had nothing to do with what was said, but related to her own inner happiness. When Natasha was invited to dance and got up with a smile and glided around the room, he particularly admired her shy grace. In the middle of the cotillon, having completed one of the figures, she was returning to her seat when another partner chose her. She was out of breath and tired, and evidently thought of declining, but immediately put her hand on her partner's shoulder and was off again, smiling at Prince Andrei. "I'll be glad to sit beside you and rest. I'm tired," said that smile, "but you see how they keep asking me, and I'm glad of it, and I'm happy and love everyone and you, and I understand all this." With his partner left her, Natasha ran across the room to choose two ladies for the figure. "If she goes first to her cousin and then to another lady, she will be my wife." Prince Andrei, to his great surprise, caught himself thinking as he watched her. She did go first to her cousin. What nonsense comes to one's mind sometimes, thought Prince Andrei. But one thing is certain, that girl is so sweet, so out of the ordinary, that she won't be a month in the ballroom before she is married. She is a rarity here, he thought, as Natasha, readjusting a rose that was falling from her bosom, sat down beside him. At the end of the collation, the old count in his blue coat came up to the young people who had been dancing. He invited Prince Andrei to come and see them, and asked his daughter whether she was enjoying herself. Natasha did not answer at once, but only looked up with a reproachful smile that seemed to say, "How can you ask such a question?" "I've enjoyed myself so much in my life," she said, and Prince Andrei noticed how slender her arms quickly rose, as if to embrace her father, and instantly drop again. Natasha had never seemed so happy. She was in that heightened state of bliss when one becomes wholly good and kind and cannot believe in the possibility of evil, unhappiness, or sorrow. At the ball, Pierre for the first time felt affronted by his wife's position in court circles. He was morose and abstracted. A deep furrow ran across his brow, and he stood at a window staring through his spectacles, seeing no one. Natasha passed him on her way to supper. She was struck by his downcast, unhappy face. She stopped in front of him, longing to help him, to bestow on him the superabundance of her own happiness. "How delightful it is, Count," she said. "Don't you think so?" Pierre, obviously not grasping what was said to him, smiled absent-mindedly. "Yes, I'm very glad," he replied. "How can anyone be discontented with anything?" Natasha wondered, "especially anyone as nice as Besikoff." In Natasha's eye, all the people at the ball were good, kind, splendid, loving one another, and incapable of offending one another, so they ought to be happy. And with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you for watching and subscribing. Give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Leave a comment below, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.